You think you know the story of Rome's most scandalous empress, Messalina, the woman who supposedly slept with 25 men in one night, ran secret brothels, and married another man while still wed to Emperor Claudius. But what if I told you that many of the facts you've heard about her were written by men who had never met her, decades after her death, with clear political agendas? Writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal crafted these tales long after Messalina was gone. Today, we're going to tear apart the ancient sources that created history's most successful character assassination. The real Messalina isn't who you think she is. Let's start with the most damning evidence against these historical accounts. The three main sources for Messalina's scandalous reputation never actually met the woman they're writing about. Tacitus wrote his Annals around 116 AD, a full 70 years after Messalina died in 48 AD. Suetonius penned his salacious tales even later, sometime after 120 AD. Juvenal was writing poetry during the same period, not history. Think about that timeline for a moment. These men were describing intimate details about a woman's private life from 7 decades in the past. Imagine if someone today wrote a detailed biography of a controversial figure from the 1950s, claiming to know intimate details about their private life, their secret affairs, their personal conversations, but had never spoken to anyone who actually knew them. You'd laugh them out of the room. Yet these are the sources we've trusted for almost 2,000 years to tell us who Messalina really was. The gap between Messalina's death and these accounts is longer than the time between World War II and today. These weren't investigative journalists with access to court records or eyewitness interviews. They had no imperial archives documenting Messalina's actual behavior. No surviving letters or diaries. No testimony from people who served in the palace during her time as empress. They were writing decades later, relying on rumors, gossip, and political propaganda that had been circulating for generations. Each retelling had likely grown more sensational, more extreme, more divorced from whatever actually happened. Here's what makes this even more suspicious. Tacitus admits in his own writing that he's crafting moral lessons, not documenting facts. His goal was to teach Romans about the dangers of imperial excess and corruption. He wanted to show what happened when power went unchecked. He wasn't trying to accurately portray Messalina's actual behavior. He was using her story as a cautionary tale, which means he had every reason to exaggerate her worst qualities and invent details that served his moral message. Suetonius was even worse. He collected scandalous stories like a tabloid editor, prioritizing entertainment value over truth. His writing reads more like ancient celebrity gossip than serious historical documentation. He loved juicy details about imperial sexual scandals because they sold copies and kept readers engaged. Truth was secondary to sensation. When you read his accounts of Messalina's supposed exploits, you're not reading history. You're reading the ancient equivalent of a supermarket tabloid. Juvenal's contributions are the most problematic of all because he was writing satirical poetry, using extreme exaggeration for comedic and moral effect. His verses about Messalina competing with prostitutes in endurance contests were meant to be funny, shocking, and obviously over the top. They were literary devices, not factual claims. Yet later historians treated his verses as eyewitness accounts, quoting his satirical poems as if they were court testimony. It's like future historians citing Saturday Night Live sketches as documentary evidence about modern politicians. The truly disturbing part becomes clear when you examine the specific language these authors use. They rely heavily on vague terms like "it was said" and "rumor had it" instead of providing concrete details. They reference unnamed sources and unspecified witnesses. When they do provide specific details, they often contradict each other or describe events that would have been physically impossible to verify. These are classic signs of unreliable sources padding thin information with speculation and hearsay. When you realize these men were essentially writing historical fiction disguised as biography, you start to see the cracks in every single claim they made. The stories become more obviously constructed, more clearly designed to serve political purposes rather than preserve accurate memories. The coincidences pile up. The moral lessons become too neat. The character arc fits too perfectly into existing Roman stereotypes about dangerous women. The foundation of Messalina's reputation rests on sources that would be laughed out of any modern courtroom as hearsay and speculation. No contemporary witnesses, no physical evidence, no documentation from people who actually lived through these events. Just decades-old rumors filtered through multiple generations of political propaganda and moral storytelling. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. These unreliable accounts became the official historical record that every subsequent generation accepted as truth. Medieval chroniclers copied their stories. Renaissance historians repeated their claims. Modern textbooks still present their versions as established fact. Each generation of scholars built on the previous one, creating layers of seeming credibility around fundamentally unreliable source material. The result is that we've been telling the same propaganda stories for almost 2 millennia, treating ancient character assassination as historical truth. Every documentary, every textbook, every popular history that describes Messalina's sexual exploits is ultimately tracing back to 3 men who never met her, writing decades after her death with clear political and literary motivations to exaggerate her worst qualities. That's not history. That's successful propaganda disguised as scholarship. But understanding who wrote these stories is only half the battle. The real question is how they managed to make their lies so convincing that we're still believing them today. The answer lies in understanding how sophisticated Roman propaganda actually operated. These writers didn't just make up random stories. They followed a careful playbook that turned political actions into sexual scandals, making their propaganda seem believable and morally justified. The Romans had perfected the art of destroying reputations through literature, and Messalina became their masterpiece of defamation. Every scandalous detail about Messalina follows the same propaganda formula. Take a grain of political truth and bury it under layers of sexual sensationalism. Start with something that actually happened, then twist the motivation, exaggerate the details, and reframe everything through a lens of sexual deviance. This technique made their lies harder to disprove because they contained just enough truth to seem plausible. Tacitus uses a technique we can call moral framing. He presents Messalina's political actions as evidence of sexual depravity. When she influences court appointments, he describes it as seducing officials. When she builds alliances with powerful senators, he calls it promiscuity. When she exercises imperial authority, he frames it as uncontrolled lust. Every single political move gets reinterpreted as sexual misconduct.
This wasn't accidental. Tacitus knew that Romans would be more outraged by sexual scandal than by political maneuvering, so he systematically converted one into the other. Look at how this works in practice.
Messalina appointed certain officials to government positions. That's normal imperial behavior. But Tacitus describes these appointments as evidence that she was sleeping with multiple men to advance their careers. He takes legitimate political activity and transforms it into prostitution. The action itself may have happened, but the sexual motivation is pure invention designed to destroy her credibility. Suetonius employs what we can call escalating exaggeration. Each story becomes more outrageous than the last. First, she's unfaithful to Claudius with one lover. Then she's having affairs with multiple men simultaneously. Then she's running brothels inside the imperial palace. Finally, she's competing with professional prostitutes in endurance contests to see who can sleep with more men in a single night. The progression isn't random. Suetonius carefully builds from believable accusations to impossible extremes, using each previous story to make the next one seem more credible. This escalation serves a specific purpose. By the time readers get to the most outrageous claims, they've already accepted the earlier, more moderate ones. Their minds are primed to believe increasingly extreme stories because they've been gradually conditioned to accept Messalina's supposed depravity. It's psychological manipulation disguised as historical narrative. The most damning technique is satirical laundering. Juvenal wrote obviously fictional poems using extreme exaggeration for comedic and moral effect. His verses about Messalina were meant to be literary entertainment, not factual claims. But later historians cited these satirical poems as if they were eyewitness accounts. They stripped away the satirical context and presented Juvenal's comic exaggerations as serious historical evidence. This created a feedback loop where fiction became fact through repetition. Juvenal's joke becomes Suetonius's anecdote, which becomes Tacitus's moral lesson, which becomes accepted historical truth. Each author lends credibility to the others, creating an illusion of multiple independent sources when they're really just recycling the same fabricated material. Look at the language patterns these authors use. Words like shameless, insatiable, and unnatural appear constantly throughout their descriptions of Messalina. These aren't neutral descriptive terms, they're loaded moral judgments designed to trigger disgust and outrage in Roman readers. The repetition of these specific words creates a psychological association between Messalina and sexual deviance, even when the authors aren't describing sexual behavior at all. But here's what's really telling. While these moral condemnations appear constantly, specific dates, locations, and verifiable details are mysteriously absent. They never tell you exactly when these supposed orgies happened. They don't name the specific officials she allegedly slept with. They don't provide witnesses who could verify their claims. The stories are heavy on sensational details, but light on the kind of factual information that could actually be investigated or confirmed. The propaganda becomes self-reinforcing as each author references the others. Tacitus mentions stories that sound similar to Suetonius's accounts. Suetonius references tales that echo Juvenal's poems. Each writer creates an echo chamber of accusations that seem credible simply because multiple sources repeat them. But when you trace the origins back, you find they're all drawing from the same pool of unverified rumors and political gossip. These weren't historians documenting facts. They were political operatives conducting a coordinated smear campaign that lasted centuries. Their goal wasn't truth, it was character destruction. They wanted to create a version of Messalina so scandalous and morally repugnant that no one would ever question her elimination or sympathize with her fate. But there's one problem with their carefully constructed lies. They forgot about the evidence that couldn't be rewritten or destroyed after the fact. Coins and sculptures created during Messalina's actual lifetime tell a completely different story. While later writers were crafting tales of sexual excess, the contemporary visual record shows a woman deliberately presented as the ideal Roman mother and wife. These weren't random artistic choices. Every visual representation of Messalina created during her years as empress was carefully designed to showcase Roman virtue and maternal dignity. Every single piece of art created while Messalina was alive contradicts the scandalous reputation that came after her death. The disconnect is so dramatic that you have to wonder how historians missed it for so long. We have dozens of coins, sculptures, and official portraits that show Messalina as the perfect Roman matron. Yet somehow, these contemporary sources got ignored, while later propaganda, written decades after her death, became accepted historical fact. The coins minted during Claudius's reign provide the clearest evidence of how Messalina was actually perceived by her contemporaries. These coins show her with her children, Britannicus and Octavia, wearing the traditional stola of a respectable Roman matron. The stola was a long, flowing dress that covered a woman from neck to feet, symbolizing modesty and virtue. Roman law actually required respectable married women to wear the stola in public. Prostitutes and adulteresses were forbidden from wearing it. Her hairstyling in these coins is equally significant. Messalina appears with the modest, center-parted hairstyle that symbolized virtue and restraint in Roman culture. This wasn't a fashionable look designed to attract attention. It was specifically chosen to communicate moral respectability. The hairstyle deliberately echoed the appearance of Livia, Augustus's wife, who had been celebrated as a model of feminine virtue for decades. The coin imagery goes further than just clothing and hair. Many show Messalina holding symbols of fertility and motherhood, cornucopias representing abundance and prosperity, grain sheaves symbolizing her role in ensuring Rome's food supply, maternal imagery that aligned perfectly with the Augustan ideal of feminine virtue that emphasized women's roles as mothers and household managers. Sculptures from her lifetime reinforce this same message. Relief carvings show her participating in religious ceremonies, fulfilling the traditional role of imperial women in maintaining Rome's relationship with the gods. She appears alongside other imperial family members in formal state portraits, positioned as an integral part of the dynasty's public image. The artistic style deliberately connects her to earlier empresses who were celebrated for their virtue. These weren't private portraits that could be faked or manipulated by later enemies. These were official state propaganda pieces, approved by the imperial court and distributed across the empire as examples of proper Roman womanhood. Every coin that left the imperial mint carried Messalina's image to Roman soldiers, merchants, and citizens throughout the Mediterranean. These images were seen by millions of people during her lifetime. The production process for these official images involved multiple levels of approval. Palace artists created initial designs. Imperial advisors reviewed the symbolism and messaging. Claudius himself would have seen and approved the final versions before they went into mass production. If Messalina was really the scandalous figure described by later writers, this entire system would have had to be either completely blind to her behavior or actively complicit in covering it up. Roman imperial imagery was incredibly sophisticated propaganda. Every symbol, every pose, every piece of clothing carried specific meaning that Romans would have understood immediately. The imperial court employed teams of artists, advisors, and cultural experts whose job was to craft the perfect public image for the ruling family. They knew exactly how to present virtue and how to present vice. The artistic choices for Messalina weren't accidental or careless. Someone made deliberate decisions to show her as a virtuous mother and wife. Someone chose the modest clothing, the respectable hairstyle, the maternal symbols. Someone positioned her alongside her children rather than alone. Someone connected her visually to previous empresses who had been celebrated for their virtue. These were calculated propaganda choices designed to present her as an ideal Roman woman. If Messalina was really running brothels, competing with prostitutes, and scandalizing Roman society with public sexual displays, why would the imperial mint be producing coins showing her as a model of virtue? Why would official sculptures present her as an ideal mother? Why would palace artists be working overtime to make her look like the most respectable woman in the empire? Romans were obsessed with maintaining proper appearances, especially for imperial family members. Any hint of scandal or impropriety would have immediately affected how the imperial court presented family members to the public. If rumors about Messalina's behavior were circulating during her lifetime, they would have shown up in the official imagery. The visual evidence from her lifetime reveals that the sexual scandal narrative was a complete fabrication created after her death. Contemporary artists, court advisors, and imperial propagandists all saw Messalina as worthy of being presented as a model Roman wife and mother. But if the contemporary evidence shows such a different picture, how did later writers manage to make their lies stick so convincingly? The answer lies in examining the one story that supposedly proves everything they claimed about her. The answer lies in examining the one story that supposedly proves everything they claimed about her. The marriage to Gaius Silius becomes the centerpiece of every accusation against Messalina. But when you strip away the moral outrage and examine the political context, a very different story emerges. One that has almost nothing to do with romance or sexual scandal. What if this wasn't a romantic affair or sexual escapade, but a calculated political move that palace factions exploited to eliminate a powerful rival? What if the real story was about succession politics, dynastic security, and imperial power struggles that got repackaged as a tale of feminine weakness and sexual betrayal? The more you examine the details, the more obvious it becomes that we've been told the wrong story for almost 2,000 years. The marriage to Silius wasn't conducted in secret shadows like later accounts suggest. It involved public ceremonies, witnesses, and legal formalities that would have been impossible to hide from the imperial court. Roman marriages, especially among the elite, required extensive documentation, religious rituals, and social recognition. You couldn't just sneak off and get married without dozens of people knowing about it. The ceremony involved priests, legal witnesses, and formal contracts that left paper trails throughout the Roman bureaucracy. Here's what makes this even more significant. Gaius Silius wasn't some random lover or opportunistic social climber. He was a consul designate, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Roman government.
This was a strategic alliance between two of Rome's most powerful political families, not a lustful affair between a bored empress and a handsome nobody. Silius came from an established senatorial family with significant wealth and political connections.
His marriage to Messalina represented a merger of imperial power with traditional aristocratic influence. The timing reveals everything about the real motivations behind this union. This happened when Claudius was away from Rome, traveling to Ostia to oversee harbor construction projects. Messalina wasn't sneaking around behind her husband's back for romantic thrills. She was acting during a window of opportunity when the emperor was absent and unable to interfere with her political maneuvering. The timing suggests careful planning and strategic thinking, not impulsive passion. Consider what Messalina may have been trying to accomplish. Her son Britannicus was still young and vulnerable in the brutal world of imperial succession politics. Claudius was in poor health and increasingly influenced by his freedman advisors who had their own agendas. Messalina may have been acting to secure her position and her son's succession rights by building a powerful alliance that could protect them both if something happened to the emperor. Roman law provided frameworks for exactly these kinds of political marriages and adoptions. Elite families regularly used marriage alliances to strengthen dynastic claims, secure political support, and protect vulnerable heirs. What looked like adultery to later moralists may have been a legitimate legal maneuver designed to ensure Britannicus could claim the throne with backing from Silius's powerful family connections. The legal context makes Messalina's actions fit established Roman political practices better than a simple adultery scandal. Roman divorce and remarriage laws were complex, but they did allow for strategic unions that could strengthen family positions. Messalina may have been following legal procedures that would have made her marriage to Silius technically valid under certain circumstances, especially if she believed Claudius's failing health made succession planning urgent. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The real scandal wasn't the marriage itself. It was how quickly certain palace advisors convinced Claudius that it represented a coup attempt against his rule. These advisors rushed back to Rome ahead of the emperor and spent crucial time crafting a narrative that transformed a political alliance into treason. They had hours to shape how Claudius would interpret events before he could see the situation for himself. The advisors' response reveals their true concerns. They didn't focus on the moral outrage of adultery or the personal betrayal of marriage vows. They concentrated on convincing Claudius that his throne was in danger. Their arguments centered on political threats, not sexual misconduct. This suggests they understood perfectly well that Messalina's marriage was fundamentally about power, not passion. These palace insiders needed to act fast because they recognized that Messalina's alliance with Silius posed a direct threat to their own influence. If she succeeded in building independent political support, she could bypass them entirely when making imperial decisions. The marriage represented a potential shift in palace power dynamics that would have left the emperor's advisors sidelined and vulnerable. The secret marriage was likely a legitimate political maneuver that got reframed as sexual betrayal by rivals who wanted Messalina eliminated. The speed with which her enemies moved to destroy her suggests they saw her actions as politically dangerous, not just morally offensive. They understood that she was building the kind of independent power base that could threaten their control over imperial policy. Once you see it as palace intrigue rather than bedroom drama, the whole story makes much more political sense. The marriage becomes a calculated move in a high-stakes game, where the prize was control over the Roman Empire's future. Messalina lost that game, but not because she was a sexual deviant. She lost because her enemies were better at manipulating the narrative and turning her political strategy into a moral scandal. But who exactly were these enemies who moved so quickly to destroy her? The answer has been hiding in plain sight in every historical account. Narcissus, Claudius's powerful freedman and secretary, appears in every version of Messalina's death story, but always as a loyal servant protecting his emperor from his wife's treachery. The ancient sources paint him as the hero who saved Rome from a scandalous empress. But when you examine his actions and motivations more carefully, a completely different picture emerges. What if Narcissus wasn't the hero of this story, but the villain who manipulated Claudius into murdering his own wife for purely selfish reasons? What if everything we've been told about his noble intentions was just another layer of the same propaganda that destroyed Messalina's reputation? The evidence suggests that Narcissus was the real architect of this entire conspiracy, using Messalina's political activities as an excuse to eliminate the biggest threat to his own power. Here's what most people don't realize about how the Roman imperial system actually worked. Narcissus controlled access to Claudius and managed much of the imperial correspondence. He decided which letters the emperor saw, which meetings got scheduled, which information reached the palace. He had more day-to-day power than most senators because he could influence imperial decisions at the source. But his position depended entirely on maintaining Claudius's favor and keeping potential rivals away from the emperor. This arrangement made Narcissus incredibly wealthy. He had built his own network of allies throughout the government, people who owed their positions to his recommendations. He collected fees for arranging meetings with the emperor. He sold access to imperial favor. He accumulated massive estates and lived like a nobleman, despite being born a slave. His wealth rivaled that of the richest senators in Rome. But Messalina threatened this entire setup because she had something Narcissus could never obtain: direct, legitimate access to the emperor through their marriage and children. She didn't need to go through the freedman's bureaucracy to influence imperial policy. She could speak to Claudius privately, present her own version of events, and bypass Narcissus entirely when she wanted to shape government decisions. This made her the most dangerous person in the palace from Narcissus's perspective. The freedman's problem wasn't that Messalina was immoral or treasonous. His problem was that she was effective. Her political activities were cutting into his influence and profits. When she arranged appointments for government positions, those officials owed loyalty to her rather than to Narcissus. When she built alliances with senators, she created alternative power centers that didn't depend on the freedman's approval. Every political success she achieved reduced his control over the imperial system. The situation became critical when Claudius left Rome for Ostia. This gave Messalina an opportunity to act independently, making political moves without the freedman's oversight. But it also gave Narcissus his chance to eliminate her permanently. He could rush back to the capital ahead of the emperor and craft a narrative about what had happened before Claudius could see the situation for himself. This is exactly what Narcissus did. He abandoned his duties with the emperor and raced back to Rome, gathering information about Messalina's marriage to Silius. But he wasn't collecting evidence of adultery or moral corruption. He was building a case for treason and political conspiracy. He spent crucial hours before Claudius's return constructing a story that would convince the emperor that his throne was in danger. The ancient sources reveal Narcissus' real priorities in their own descriptions of his actions. They describe him asking Claudius whether his throne was secure, not whether his marriage was intact. He focused on political threats, not personal betrayal. He presented Messalina's marriage as evidence of a coup attempt, not as a sexual scandal. His arguments centered on power and survival, not morality and virtue. This focus reveals what Narcissus actually understood about the situation. He knew perfectly well that Messalina's marriage to Silius was fundamentally political, not romantic. He recognized that she was building independent support that could threaten his own influence. His response wasn't motivated by loyalty to Claudius or concern for Roman morality. It was a calculated move to eliminate a rival who had become too powerful to control. The speed and efficiency of Narcissus's actions show careful planning, not spontaneous outrage. He moved immediately to isolate Claudius from other sources of information. He controlled the narrative by presenting his version of events first. He manipulated a confused and paranoid emperor into making an irreversible decision before anyone could offer alternative explanations or defend Messalina. Narcissus successfully convinced Claudius to order the execution of his own wife, eliminating the biggest threat to the freedman's power. The sexual scandal narrative was just the cover story that made the political assassination palatable to Roman society. By framing Messalina's elimination as moral enforcement rather than political murder, Narcissus protected himself from accusations of manipulation or self-interest. The real story of Messalina's death isn't about an immoral empress who betrayed her husband. It's about a cunning political operator who destroyed a rival by convincing that rival's own husband to murder her. But Narcissus's manipulation was only possible because of the legal system that made his accusations so devastating. Roman law created a perfect trap that could destroy any empress who dared to exercise real political power. The legal system wasn't neutral or fair. It was deliberately constructed to give men complete control over women's lives while making any independent female action potentially criminal. The same legal framework that gave men unlimited sexual freedom made any independent action by a woman potentially treasonous. Roman men could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, and other men's wives without facing serious legal consequences. They could divorce and remarry multiple times. They could maintain mistresses alongside their legal wives. But women faced completely different rules that made almost any behavior outside strict domestic roles legally dangerous. The Lex Julia de Adulteris made adultery a public crime, but only for women. This law, passed by Augustus decades before Messalina's time, turned female sexuality into a matter of state security. Men could have multiple affairs without legal consequences, while women faced exile or death for the same behavior. The law didn't just punish adultery, it made women's sexual choices a political issue that could be weaponized by enemies. Here's what made this law particularly vicious. It defined adultery so broadly that almost any independent action by a married woman could be interpreted as sexual misconduct. Meeting with men without her husband's permission could be seen as adultery. Entertaining guests alone could be evidence of immoral behavior. Even appearing in public without proper supervision could be twisted into accusations of sexual impropriety. The law created a framework where a woman's political activities could always be reframed as sexual crimes. When Messalina influenced government appointments, her enemies could claim she was sleeping with officials to advance their careers. When she built alliances with senators, they could argue she was using sexual favors to gain political support. The law made it impossible for women to engage in politics without exposing themselves to accusations of sexual corruption. Even worse, the law was written so broadly that any woman who acted without her husband's explicit permission could be accused of undermining his authority and, by extension, the state itself. Roman legal theory held that a wife's disobedience to her husband represented a threat to social order. If women could ignore their husband's commands, the entire hierarchy that kept Roman society stable would collapse. This legal principle meant that Messalina's political activities were inherently suspect under Roman law. Every decision she made without Claudius's direct approval could be seen as evidence of dangerous independence. Every alliance she built could be interpreted as undermining imperial authority. The law turned normal political behavior into potential treason when performed by a woman. The cult of Pudicitia made the situation even worse by demanding that elite women demonstrate virtue through complete submission and sexual purity. This religious and social system created impossible standards that could be weaponized against political rivals. Women had to be perfectly modest, completely obedient, and absolutely pure to maintain their social standing. Any deviation from these standards provided ammunition for enemies. Pudicitia wasn't just about personal behavior, it was about public performance of feminine virtue. Women had to constantly prove their worthiness through visible displays of modesty and submission. They wore specific clothing, adopted certain hairstyles, and followed rigid social protocols that demonstrated their commitment to traditional values. Any woman who stepped outside these narrow boundaries became vulnerable to attack. The truly disturbing part is how these religious and legal standards reinforced each other. The law made independent female action criminal. The cult of Pudicitia made it immoral. Together, they created a system where any woman who threatened male power could be destroyed simply by questioning her sexual virtue, regardless of the actual evidence. Messalina's real crime wasn't sexual excess. It was exercising the kind of political influence that Roman law reserved exclusively for men. Every alliance she built, every appointment she influenced, every policy she shaped could be reframed as evidence of moral corruption. The legal system gave her enemies the tools they needed to transform legitimate political activity into criminal sexual behavior. The legal framework meant that accusations of sexual impropriety didn't require proof in the modern sense. The law assumed that women who acted independently were probably sexually corrupt. The burden was on the accused woman to prove her innocence, not on accusers to provide evidence of guilt. This made character assassination incredibly easy and defense nearly impossible. Roman courts didn't require witnesses to sexual acts or physical evidence of adultery. Circumstantial evidence was sufficient for conviction. A woman's independent political activities could serve as proof of sexual crimes because the law assumed that political ambition in women was inherently connected to sexual deviance. The legal system itself encoded the propaganda techniques that destroyed Messalina's reputation. The law itself was the weapon that turned political rivalry into a death sentence. Narcissus and other male political operators didn't need to prove that Messalina was actually immoral. They just needed to show that she had acted independently, and Roman law would do the rest. But eliminating Messalina physically was only the beginning of their plan. Destroying her physical presence was just the first step in a comprehensive campaign to control how history would remember her. The damnatio memoriae that followed Messalina's death became one of the most thorough character assassinations in Roman history. This wasn't just about removing her from monuments or scratching her name off buildings. It was about rewriting the past to justify her murder and prevent anyone from questioning the official narrative. Teams of workers systematically defaced coins bearing Messalina's image, chiseled her name from inscriptions, and destroyed or altered sculptures that showed her in a positive light. The process was methodical and comprehensive. Craftsmen went through the imperial mint's inventory, finding every coin that featured Messalina's portrait and either melting them down or physically scraping away her image. Stone carvers visited public buildings throughout Rome, identifying inscriptions that mentioned her name and carefully removing every letter. Sculptors modified existing statues, changing facial features or replacing heads entirely to eliminate her likeness. This physical destruction required massive coordination and resources. The Roman government organized work crews specifically for this task. They provided tools, transportation, and supervision to ensure the job got done properly. The scale of the operation reveals how seriously they took the threat of Messalina's memory surviving intact. Every coin, every inscription, every sculpture that portrayed her positively had to disappear. But the memory erasure went deeper than just removing physical evidence. The Senate officially condemned her memory through formal legal proceedings, making it dangerous for anyone to defend her or question the circumstances of her death. This wasn't just symbolic condemnation. It was legally binding censorship that carried real penalties for violations. The Damnatio Memoria created a legal framework that made discussing Messalina's positive qualities or questioning her execution potentially treasonous. Roman senators understood the implications of this decree perfectly. Anyone who publicly defended Messalina or suggested she might have been treated unfairly could face accusations of supporting enemies of the state. The legal condemnation turned sympathy for her into a political liability. It made questioning the official narrative about her death professionally and personally dangerous for anyone with something to lose. Any historian, poet, or artist who wanted to present a different version of Messalina's story risked being accused of treason or moral corruption themselves. The condemnation created a chilling effect that extended far beyond government officials. Private citizens, including writers and artists, had to consider whether defending Messalina was worth risking their careers, property, or lives. Most decided it wasn't worth the risk. This legal intimidation was incredibly effective at silencing alternative narratives. Writers who might have known different details about Messalina's life or death kept quiet rather than face potential prosecution. Artists stopped creating works that might be interpreted as sympathetic to her memory. The threat of legal consequences made self-censorship the safest option for anyone who disagreed with the official version of events. The erasure was so effective that within a generation, the only facts anyone knew about Messalina were the scandalous stories that justified her execution. Young Romans growing up after her death had no access to positive information about her. They never saw coins showing her as a virtuous mother. They never read inscriptions celebrating her contributions to imperial policy. They never encountered sculptures depicting her as a respected empress. Instead, they only heard the propaganda stories that painted her as a sexual deviant who deserved death. These became the accepted facts about her life because no alternative information survived the systematic destruction campaign. The memory erasure created an information vacuum that got filled entirely by hostile propaganda. This created a feedback loop where each new generation of writers had access only to the propaganda versions of her story, making the lies seem more credible over time. Historians writing 20 years after her death consulted sources that had already been filtered through the Damnatio Memoriae. They found only negative accounts because positive ones had been systematically destroyed or suppressed. These later historians didn't realize they were working with incomplete information. They assumed the scandalous stories were accurate because those were the only sources available to them. Their writings then became source material for even later historians, each generation building on the previous one's propaganda-tainted accounts. The process continued for decades and centuries. Each new author who wrote about Messalina used sources that traced back to the same hostile propaganda created immediately after her death. The lies became more credible through repetition and the passage of time. What started as obvious political character assassination gradually transformed into accepted historical fact. The Damnatio Memoriae didn't just erase Messalina from history. It replaced her with a fictional character designed to serve as a warning to other powerful women. The woman who emerged from this process wasn't the real empress who had lived and died in the 1st century. She was a carefully constructed cautionary tale about what happened to women who overstepped traditional boundaries. By the time modern historians started questioning these sources, the propaganda had been accepted as fact for almost 2,000 years. The memory assassination had been so thorough and successful that recovering the real Messalina became nearly impossible. Her enemies had won completely, creating a version of history that served their purposes for 2 millennia. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The techniques they used weren't invented specifically for Messalina. These character assassination techniques formed a standardized playbook that Roman writers used against any woman who threatened male political power. When you know what to look for, you can see the same propaganda methods being deployed against powerful women throughout Roman history. The specific language, the moral framing, the sexual accusations, even the timing of when these stories appeared, it all follows an identical blueprint that was tested and refined on multiple targets over several generations. Take Livia, Augustus's wife, who ruled alongside him for decades and was celebrated as a model of Roman virtue during her lifetime. Contemporary sources praised her wisdom, her devotion to family, and her support for her husband's policies. But after her death, when she could no longer defend herself, later historians began accusing her of poisoning multiple family members to secure power for her son Tiberius. The accusations only appeared decades after the supposed events, written by people who had never met her, using the same vague language and unverifiable claims that would later destroy Messalina. The timing reveals everything about these accusations against Livia. During her lifetime, when people who actually knew her could contradict false stories, she was portrayed as virtuous and politically helpful. But once she was safely dead and her defenders were gone, the character assassination began. Later writers needed to explain how a woman had managed to wield so much influence for so long, and poisoning provided a convenient explanation that made her success seem sinister rather than impressive. Agrippina the Younger, who became Messalina's successor as Claudius's wife, faced identical charges of sexual excess and political manipulation, using almost the same language and narrative structure. The accusations against her read like a copy-paste job of the Messalina propaganda.
She was accused of sleeping with officials to advance their careers, manipulating imperial appointments through sexual favors, and using her beauty to control political decisions. Even the specific phrases used to describe her behavior echo the earlier attacks on Messalina. This repetition wasn't coincidence. It was a deliberate strategy. Roman writers had found that sexual accusations were more effective at destroying powerful women than political criticism, so they kept using the same formula. Why invent new propaganda techniques when the existing ones worked so well? The sexual scandal approach had successfully eliminated Messalina, so they applied it to every subsequent woman who threatened male political control. Julia the Elder, Augustus's daughter, provides another perfect example of this pattern in action. She was exiled on adultery charges that conveniently eliminated her from the succession dispute and removed her political influence at exactly the moment when her presence became inconvenient for male relatives. The charges appeared suddenly, without warning, just when her political position posed problems for the men around her. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The accusations against Julia followed the same structure as later attacks on Messalina and Agrippina. Political activities got reframed as sexual misconduct. Independent decision-making became evidence of moral corruption. Building alliances with powerful men was transformed into sleeping with them for personal gain. The language, the moral framing, even the specific types of accusations remained consistent across decades of character assassinations.
The pattern is always the same. Take a woman's political actions, reframe them as sexual misconduct, then use the moral outrage to justify her elimination from public life. The process was so standardized that you can predict how it will unfold. First, identify a woman with independent political influence. Second, reinterpret her political activities as evidence of sexual deviance. Third, use moral outrage to justify her removal. Fourth, erase positive information about her and replace it with scandalous propaganda. Even women who successfully navigated Roman politics during their lifetimes found their reputations destroyed by later male historians who needed to explain away their inconvenient success. The pattern shows that no woman was safe from character assassination, regardless of how carefully she followed social expectations or how successfully she avoided scandal during her actual life. If later writers needed to diminish her accomplishments, they would invent sexual scandals to make her success seem illegitimate. The effectiveness of these techniques created a feedback loop that reinforced itself across generations. Each successful character assassination provided a template for the next one. Writers learned that sexual accusations worked better than political criticism, so they kept using the same approach. The propaganda became so normalized that later historians didn't even recognize they were perpetuating character assassination rather than documenting historical facts. Messalina wasn't the victim of a unique scandal. She was the target of a systematic process designed to ensure that no woman could challenge male political dominance. The techniques that destroyed her reputation were refined through practice on multiple targets, creating a reliable method for eliminating female political influence through moral condemnation. Understanding this pattern changes how we should read any scandalous story about powerful women from history. These same methods shape how we evaluate powerful women today. The next time you hear a scandalous story about a woman in politics or business, ask yourself, who wrote this account? When did they write it? And what did they have to gain from destroying her reputation? Messalina's real crime wasn't sexual excess. It was being a woman who refused to stay powerless in a system designed to eliminate female influence through character assassination. The techniques that destroyed her reputation are still being used today, which means understanding her story isn't just about ancient history. It's about recognizing how propaganda works in our own time.